I'm Mangino. Welcome to the Mangino Talks Pittsburgh podcast. We talk about everything that matters to us all, from current events to Pittsburgh history, social issues to sports, politics, to practical day-to-day life. And today, we're talking about the U.S. military. This region of Pennsylvania has historically been a very proud region when it comes to service to country. Very high percentage of veterans that have lived here throughout Allegheny County and the surrounding counties. But we're coming across a problem right now, and it's with people who are willing to join the military. According to a recent report, the U.S. Army fell 15,000 recruits shy in a recent year. They are looking for about 60,000 recruits every year, and they were 15,000 shy. That's 1/4 of the total number of recruits. The concern then becomes, to what extent are we putting our national security at risk? If we don't have the people who are willing to serve, we also have people who are willing, but they're just not able. There's a multifaceted issue here that I want to address, and we will do that with Jeff McCausland. He's been a frequent guest on the show with me when I was on radio. He's a CBS News military analyst, national security consultant, retired U.S. Army colonel, and author of Battle-Tested Gettysburg Leadership Lessons for 21st Century Leaders. You can find him on Twitter and Facebook by searching McCausland, Jeff McCausland, and he is joining us now on Mangino Talks. And Colonel, welcome. Good to have you on.
Robert, it's a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. Where do you see us right now from your perspective when it comes to the issue of recruiting, the fact that we are having such great difficulty right now hitting our goals, and it doesn't seem as though there's a real end in sight for this?
No, I think that's right. And in many ways, you could say it's a sea change. You know, it's really interesting if you reflect on this sort of historically. Right now, we have just passed the 50th anniversary of the all-volunteer Army. When I entered the Army back in the late 1960s at the height of the Vietnam War, of course, it was a draftee Army, and every young man at the age of 18 had to register for the draft, and that's what a large base of the force was conscripted. But for 50 years now, it's been an all-volunteer force. That's what the American people wanted. We've also passed the 75th anniversary of an integrated force, in which, of course, back during World War II, African Americans particularly served, as did Asian Americans. But they were in segregated units, oftentimes with white officers, black soldiers, or Asian soldiers. But with Harry Truman in the late 1940s, the decision was made to integrate the force, one of the big efforts to integrate the population in the civil rights era. So that's kind of where we're at. Also, demographically, it's also been interesting to me that really if you line up 10, 18-year-olds, I'm told, right now, only 3 to 4 of them will qualify to join the military. That's based on health, a lot of obesity amongst youngsters, sadly, based on education levels, high school diplomas, GEDs, and the like, based on their problem, perhaps having had some run-in with the police, use of drugs, and those kind of things. So just based on who could join if they wanted to, only about 3 to 4 out of 10 can do that. In the aftermath of the end of the war in Afghanistan, we kind of saw a drop-off. I don't know if that was really the enthusiasm that the nation generated in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, now waning. That maybe was part of it. Maybe COVID again, where people were more reluctant to live in close spaces. The idea of joining the military and living in real close spaces obviously had a less appeal. But we're also seeing, some interesting phenomena in that a large portion of the force, frankly, come from families in which a family member had served in the military, some being career military. So a lot of recruits come from military families, and as you talk to the influencers, the football coach, the high school teacher, or even in the family, or their cleric or whatever, we find those influencers not being quite as motivating young people to join the military. And as a consequence, this is a real challenge and a real national security problem as we move forward into what looks like it's going to be a very, very difficult time with big challenges on the world horizon from Russia and from the Chinese.
Yeah, there are so many things to talk about and so many different trails to go down. How about if we start off with those influencers that are not encouraging young people to join the military? There is an interesting story in the Wall Street Journal that actually focuses on the idea that there are a lot of veterans that are not encouraging their children to join, whether it's their children, nieces, nephews, whatever it might be. Is that a surprising statistic to you that veterans are discouraging the young people in their lives from joining the military?
It is somewhat. There's no doubt about it. A couple things play here. One, the economy is doing very well. If you look back historically in terms of recruiting, whenever the economy is doing well, the military has a tough time recruiting. So I think a lot of those influencers saying, gee whiz, you got an awful lot of opportunities out there that you can take advantage of. The military is only one of them. Second of all, if you're a veteran, you know full well, this is a pretty tough life. This is not for the faint of heart. And it not only is going to be tough on you, it's going to be tough on your family. So I think we find a lot of people in the Gen X category of people, demography, in terms of millennials, frankly, a lot more concerned about family issues, frankly, than you might see if you talk to people in my generation. I'm a baby boomer. So as a consequence, not only is it going to be tough for you, it's going to be tough for your family. Obviously, we live in a world of a lot more dual income marriages than we have ever before, and that is necessary to maintain a certain level of income. Well, the military makes that pretty tough. If a couple marries, let's say the guy's in the military and his spouse is not, her maintaining a career is going to be tough, frankly, because of all the moving around. Even if she's a professional person, a teacher, a nurse, or whatever, attorney, it's going to be tough for her to have a career path because of all that moving around. And stability obviously generates a bigger opportunity. And even within the military, I know a number of couples who are two-career marriages within the military. But again, though, the military tries real hard to, make sure you both get assigned together. I've got a good young friend of mine right now, Major. He's married to a lovely young woman who's a captain. She's in special operations. Well, he's being sent to Europe because of his specialties. She was going to be sent to Korea because of her specialties. Those are the requirements. And as a consequence, she's probably going to leave the military. So I think all those factors play into this problem as well.
When it comes to that, how do you see the military making the adjustments in order to try to shore up the forces? I mean, we're going to talk about a couple of other different aspects of this as well, but is this something that the Pentagon is looking at addressing in some way?
Oh, absolutely, without question. One thing the military and the Army has done is create a thing called pre-basic training. And that is for a youngster who would really like to join the military, but for some reason can't qualify academically, can't qualify oftentimes physically. So what we do is we put them into pre-basic training, try to get them into shape so they can pass the basic qualifications to then go on to basic training. And I'm told that program so far, albeit somewhat small, has been quite successful. A lot of the cultural wars we have experienced in the last few years, yes, I think affect this problem because the military not only integrated 75 years ago over lines of color. Obviously, we brought on board women. About 20% of the force or so are female. About roughly half or so of our population, of course, is female. About 24% of the military is female. So making accommodations for young women to join the military is very important. LGBTQ people, and obviously the demands of the military today are quite different than they were, 50 odd years ago when I joined the military. Basic trainee infantry guy didn't need a whole lot of training. Well, now today, the sophistication of drones and all the other things we do, that needs to be a pretty sophisticated person. And if you talk about cyber warfare and the things that like that, well, I don't really much care, frankly, candidly, about a person's sexual orientation. If they're the best cyber warrior going, put them behind a computer and let them fight it out with the Chinese in cyberspace. That's fine with me. But obviously, there's a lot of pushback in opposition to that. So I think military is trying to appeal to the entirety of the population. Number one, trying to particularly appeal, frankly, to young women. That means a whole lot of things about families, healthcare, medical leave, particularly for having children and things like that, become very, very important. And of course, the whole dual income marriage. And we've seen some real difficulties here. I mean, to me, most recently we had the United States Congress, as far as I was concerned, load up the defense budget, which is normally a very clean thing about how much we spend on airplanes and tanks and ships and whatever, how much we pay the troops. But they added a whole bunch of issues which really were very cultural. We're going to eliminate the possibility for a service member having travel paid for by the government and medical leave if she requires an abortion or if she requires any kind of reproductive health care. Well, they want to eliminate that. We're going to eliminate all diversity training and education in the military. We're going to eliminate that. We're going to eliminate any treatment for anybody who is transgender in terms not only of surgery, but of just hormone therapy and things like that. We're going to eliminate that. Well, it seems to me, at least, that runs against our problem, because that, to me, indirectly at least, it discourages all those people, male, female, LGBTQ, people of color, from joining the force at a moment when we desperately need them.
Are we at a point to where we're evaluating whether or not we need the standing military, the size that we are currently hoping and projecting for?
Well, you got two problems. That's exactly right. You either figure out a way to generate the size force that you think you need, or you reevaluate and say, we're going to go to a smaller force. I mean, it's just economics. And what that also may do is put greater pressure on a reserve and guard, particularly for the Army and the Air Force. Don't forget, a substantial portion of the force is in the reserve or in the Army or Air National Guard. Well, if we're having fewer and fewer active units, and by golly, we're going to probably be calling up the National Guard and the reserves to augment those particular missions that that are demanded we perform by the National Command Authority.
Mm-hmm. There are some that suggest that maybe we should take a page from the Israeli system where there is some aspect of mandatory service. Maybe it doesn't require a full 2-4 year commitment in the regular army, but at least some aspect of doing some service in the Guard and Reserve. Your thought about that approach?
Well, I'm a big believer in the whole national service thing, but not necessarily solely for the military. I think there's an awful lot to be said to teach young people that there's more to being a citizen of this great country than just paying your taxes. And oh, by the way, here's 40 bucks and two tax advisors that'll try to help you figure out a way not to pay your taxes anyway. So it seems to me we ought to have more about being a citizen than just going through that. And as a consequence, whether it would be being in the military, working in the Peace Corps, working in Vista, whatever it might be, spending some time doing that, I think would be, good for the nation in a whole host of ways. In the military, the problem is, again, sophistication required even for the most, basic jobs in the military requires a good bit of time. Train an infantry guy probably takes a good 6 to 8 months to get him or her qualified on a Bradley fighting vehicle, on weapons, on night vision goggles, on drones, a whole bunch of things.
Wow.
Well, so if we give an 18-month or a 2-year tour on national service, by the time you get to begin trained to give them a little leave, you're rolling them out as fast as you're rolling them in. So it does not become terribly cost effective. But finally, and most importantly, that's a political decision for the people who are going to be listening to this broadcast. And the American people want all their children to be involved in that kind of service. And now, of course, in the 21st century, let's not kid ourselves. Back when I was a youngster, it was going to be all males were drafted,
right.
Nothing for females being drafted. So if you went to a national service or conscription now, it would have to be male and female.
That's true. Going to this idea of some level of service, we have an image in our mind right now of patriotism, which is getting, warm and fuzzy feelings when you go to a ball game and there's a jet flyover.
Right.
And then we see somebody who served and we just say, thank you for your service. And then, we love to see the flag flying and we think that's patriotism. It seems as though if we're going to really try to instill some aspect of real patriotism, it comes back to some aspect of community service and what are you doing in order to really uplift this entire country that we have?
Well, again, Robert, you and I are in violent agreement. And I often say to youngsters at the college I teach at, I would urge you at some point in your life, and the most usually practical way is right after you finish up high school or after you finish up college, to go out and be part of something that's bigger than you are.
Yes.
Be part of something that's bigger than you are. Now that could be national service. That could be service in my community for a nonprofit. That could be a mission if I'm part of a religious community that has those kind of things. Whatever. But I think that's very important, not only for the person's individual development, and I think having a high quality of life, but also good for the community and reminding everybody that, we're all in this together. The great poem about no man is an island is absolutely correct. And despite the fact that in many ways, social media and all kinds of things like that kind of polarize us or fragment us into atoms, we need those things to remind us that we're all part of this great place called the United States of America and all have a stake in the future of that country.
Do you see the role of political division impacting our ability to recruit individuals where the way that we see things politically, whoever happens to be the president, that all of a sudden service for the country in the military is viewed through that lens?
Yeah, I really worry about that a lot. I mean, one thing that we Americans don't understand is that we have imbued in the culture of the U.S. military the firm belief of civil control of the military. Mm-hmm. Now, that's sort of a given for us Americans. We don't think about the fact that if you go around the world and you examine the history of many countries, there are very few countries on this planet where at some time in that history of that country, the military didn't decide to move and take over the political leadership. You get down to the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and I'm running out, okay? Mm-hmm. Even the British, don't forget, Oliver Cromwell, who took out the king and gave him a haircut down to his shoulder blades and became a military dictator of Great Britain for a good period of time. And when I used to deal with my British friends, they used to say to me, do you know why it's the Royal Air Force, the Royal Navy, and the British Army? And I said, why is that? I said, because the British Army once went out and gave the king a haircut down to his shoulder blades. That's why. So as a consequence, we have to keep that in mind. And I have really been concerned, quite frankly, I'll name names here, that I thought President Trump on many occasions tried to draw the military into the political fights he was having within the country. I thought that was unbelievably dangerous. And right now, again, I think what's happened in the Congress by adding these particular measures, which really are cultural issues for the military and for the society, and putting them in the defense budget is really dangerous. It breaks a whole precedent we've never done before. If you can put those kind of things into the defense budget, why couldn't you put in the defense budget? Well, in future, every general officer has to be a Democrat. Every general officer has to be Republican. We can put that. You can put those. Why couldn't we put that into legislation if we wanted to, if we controlled the Congress? That sounds silly. It really does sound terribly silly. But there are countries around the world that do that. Okay. Wow. And furthermore, I mean, right now you've got the good old Senator Tuberville from Alabama, who's held up all confirmations and all promotions, now about 200 or 300 senior officers. We're very likely by this fall not to have a chief of staff of the Army, a chief of naval operations, a commandant of the Marine Corps, chief of staff of the Air Force, or a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Why won't we have people in those positions? They will all be vacant. Why will they be vacant? Because Senator Tuberville, one senator, not supported by any other member of his party, is refusing to allow a vote on those particular confirmations on the floor of the Senate until the United States Department of Defense removes this policy of allowing young females to seek reproductive health care or abortions outside of the place where they're assigned. Well, again, that's very dangerous. And despite the fact that the senior military leadership say publicly that this is detrimental to national security, to recruiting, et cetera, Senator Tuberville, because of his vast military background, that's a joke, by the way, his vast background in football, knows far more about national security, I guess, than they do.
Do you have a genuine concern that if you don't have permanent leaders in all of these hundreds of positions, that military readiness, especially if things were to get out of control in Eastern Europe with Ukraine, and now there's this talk about, we have all been watching what's happening in Taiwan. Do you see this political instability that we have empowering and giving confidence to our adversaries to make moves that they otherwise would not make?
It's certainly possible, but even more, I think, worrisome is the fact that if you had a sudden crisis, which could come about because a missile goes in the wrong direction, or two ships bump into each other in the middle of the night, or an airplane crosses a border and gets shot down, or whatever happens, that you could have a crisis and suddenly your leadership is not what it should be. People are not in position who have become experienced. They're not there. They're just not there. So that's why I say that to me, that this is a serious national security problem from the standpoint of just this immediate problem of allowing people to be promoted and confirmed. But even more broadly, it's a serious national security problem if we start using the defense budget as a mechanism to play around with that very, very precious issue, which is the military having, embracing civil control of the military, and the civilian leadership saying, we're not going to politicize the military. That's something we stay away from. Right. Because this, to me, is an overt effort to politicize the military on the part of Senator Tuberville.
I wonder to what extent our service in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and primarily Afghanistan over 20 plus years, ultimately culminating with the evacuation of Kabul and the video that everybody had seen and the criticisms that have come down regarding that. But I think the greater issue is the fact that we were there for over 20 years and we lost so many soldiers' lives in battle. When they came home, so many more committed suicide, the maiming of so many physically and psychologically, and the idea of what was it all for? Why did people go and fight and die and sacrifice, to what end? And I'm wondering your thoughts to how does that play into all of this recruitment issue and the doubts that people have that when they're going to go and serve their country, they're truly serving a vital national interest in defense of the homeland and not just somebody else's whims and wishes and half-baked ideas about going off to war somewhere?
Yeah, I think a certain amount of disillusionment, if you go back historically, you found a certain amount of disillusionment in the 1920s after World War I, where people went off and fought World War I, and then a few years later look back on that and say, what was that all about? Why did we lose all those guys? Why did my buddy get killed? For what? For what? And you mentioned early on, as we were talking about this, why veterans don't encourage youngsters to join the military. Well, having experienced Iraq or Afghanistan for multiple tours, the generation coming out of the Army right now are the ones that spend multiple tours in both those places, and seeing how that all turned out are by nature, I think, somewhat disillusioned and less than eager to encourage youngsters perhaps to follow that path. And then finally, of course, let's face it, when the United States was hit on September 11th, 2001, there was an immediate rise in patriotism all across the country. And youngsters rushed to join the military in defense of the country. That motivated them to do that. Mm-hmm. Well, if you go through that for 20 years, and then the outcome is what we saw with Afghanistan, a certain amount of disillusionment, I think, is only natural.
Right. But let me ask you this, too. Considering that we did have that rise after 9/11, if I am correct in what I've learned, and please correct me if I'm wrong, when World War II broke out and we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, we had a very, very small standing army. Very, very few soldiers, not much of military equipment whatsoever, but the American people rose to the occasion when they were called upon. Does that give you any confidence moving forward as we're having a difficult time with recruitment, as we're having a difficult time with political ideologies and their influences in the Pentagon budget and all of that? The idea that if something tragic were to happen, ultimately the American people will rise up. Are there enough examples in your mind that give you confidence moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at when World War II began, the United States Army was smaller than Portugal's at the onset of World War II. That's where we were. And obviously by then, 1942, and by the summer of 42, we see the U.S. Army participating in invasions of North Africa, and Marines and Army participating in invasions of various islands out in the South Pacific. So we mobilized very rapidly. But, it's also an interesting period of time to look. If you look back in the 1930s, there was a massive, massive movement in the United States called the American Firsters Movement. Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. That's what they were called. 900,000 people were card-carrying members of the American Firsters. They had massive rallies at Madison Square Garden and all across the country. There was a scheduled rally of the American Firsters in Chicago, Illinois, scheduled for the evening of December the 7th, 1941. It was postponed and later canceled. So there was an awful lot of opposition to the military and participation in the wider global affairs in the immediate aftermath of World War I in the 1930s. Interestingly enough, one of the leaders of that particular movement was Charles Lindbergh, and there were members of that movement in the United States Senate, the United States House. But, along comes Pearl Harbor, and then shortly thereafter, the Germans declare war on the United States, and that movement quickly disappeared.
Once again, we are talking with Jeff McCausland, CBS News military analyst and national security advisor. Looking to the future a little bit, what do you think the future holds for us in being able to hit our recruitment goals and to get to the numbers that they're saying that they want? And can you see us going back to where we just decide to have a smaller standing army as we wrap this up?
Well, we could be forced to do that just by the mathematics of all things. That just may be what has happened. But, the question on whether or not we're going to be able to recruit people, in many ways, people say, what's the military going to do about that? And my response is, what's the Congress going to do about that?
Oh.
This is really a political choice. This is a political choice. This is not a military choice. Yeah, the military will try to come up with policies and procedures that encourage retainment. But it's really up to the Congress.
Jeff McCausland, CBS News military analyst and national security consultant, retired U.S. Army colonel, and author of Battle-Tested, Gettysburg Leadership Lessons for 21st Century Leaders. Thank you very much, Jeff McCausland. Do appreciate it. Thank you very much for your time, sir. And I want to remind all of you that you can listen to the Mangino Talks podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also go to my website, manginotalks.com. I want to thank you all for listening to the show. Please be sure to click the subscribe button so you don't miss an episode. For more on me and the show, make sure you visit manginotalks.com. If there's a topic that you would like me to talk about or a guest that you would like me to have on, send me an email at mangino@manginotalks.com. Follow me on your favorite social media platform by using @ManginoTalks. And then once you find me, please like, follow, subscribe, and share the pages with your friends and your family. And thanks again for listening to the Mangino Talks podcast.
Talk to you. Oh, I want to talk to you.